Hello, Anatomy. Welcome to our lecture video on Chapter 11, the Cardiovascular System. So the way that we're going to cover Chapter 11 is the first video that we've already done was the one on where we drew the schematic of the heart and went through the big heart foldable to talk about the structures of the heart and to some extent the functions of those structures. So this video, my intention here is to only do one video where we actually have the notes on Chapter 11, because doing that schematic and doing the foldable, that's a third up to a half of what this chapter's content actually is, and that part we've already done. So what I want to do, we're going to go through the first maybe third or half of this PowerPoint relatively quickly, because again, it's just on the parts of the heart. And then we'll get to some more physiology stuff later in this video. So we've already said a lot of this. Your cardiovascular system is a closed system. You have a heart which pumps blood, and you have vessels which circulate the blood throughout your body. Closed system just means that your blood never really leaves your cardiovascular system. In some animals like insects, things that have lymphatic fluid, the circulatory fluid actually leaves blood vessels and bathes tissues directly. That doesn't happen with humans. The two main functions here would be to deliver oxygen and nutrients to your cells and tissues, and to then take waste products like toxins or carbon dioxide from your tissues and take them back to say your liver or to your lungs to actually breathe out, in the case of carbon dioxide, to exhale CO2. Okay, so the location, so it's in your thorax, in your chest, it's between your lungs. This word, mediastinum, is the sort of like the central cavity of your lungs or your chest, sort of between your lungs where your heart and the main blood vessels coming off your heart are located. It's about the size of your fist. The heart's not particularly large. The apex, the point of your heart, points toward your left hip. The base of the heart, which the base is the flat top part, this is the base here, points to your right shoulder. And this is just the same diagram, larger. So your lungs sort of surround your heart. Like to get to your heart, you have to pull back the different lobes of your lungs. So in the first video, with the video that we already did that went through the schematics of the heart, we've really already gone through most of this. We're not going to go through it again. Actually, we will go through it again in terms of your notes. We're really going through what they do. We've really already covered this. Let me move my face real quick. So in terms of the membranes that surround the heart, so the pericardium, back in I think it was chapter 4, when we did body membranes, we probably briefly discussed the pericardium. The pericardium is the membrane that surrounds your heart. It's a double-walled sac. Remember we did fibrous membranes and serous membranes back in chapter 4. The fibrous membrane is the outer part of your pericardium. It's loose. It's, again, the outer part. The serous membrane is the part underneath the fibrous pericardium, which is what actually makes contact with the heart. And it has two layers of its own, which that's what serous membranes do. They have two layers with fluid in between, if you remember back to chapter 4. So there's three different muscle layers of the heart. There's epicardium, there's myocardium, and there's endocardium. These are listed from out to in. The epicardium is the outside of the heart. The myocardium, myo means muscle. So the myocardium is the middle part of your heart, the heart wall at least, and it's mainly cardiac muscle. It's what really does the beating of the contracting. And the endocardium is the inner layer, or the epithelial layer, or I'm sorry, the endothelial layer. If you look at a picture, here you can see the heart wall. Here you see epicardium right here. Here you see the myocardium, which is much thicker. Here you see endocardium, and then you're inside inside the chambers of the heart. You can see here we're blowing up this little inset right here. So this picture is a cross-section of the heart. And again, when we did the foldable, we've already seen this. We are going to go through the chambers and the valves briefly in this video, but most of this should sort of already make sense to you. So going through the chambers quickly. So first off, we've already said this, but let me go back a second. In anatomy diagrams, left and right are reversed. This is not new. The idea is if you superimpose this picture on yourself, the left and right would be switched. So looking at it, when you label things on a diagram, left and right are switched. That's hopefully not new. So the 4 chambers, so you have 2 atria and 2 ventricles, so 4 chambers total. The atria are called receiving chambers because they receive blood. The ventricles are discharging or pumping chambers because they're the ones that pump blood either to your lungs or to the rest of your body. So a septum just means like a wall. So the interventricular septum, so interventricular means between the ventricles, interatrial means between the two atria, and they're just layers of tissue that separate either the two ventricles or the two atria. Here you can see the one right here that's separating the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Notice in this picture too, we've already discussed this, but how the left ventricle is so much thicker than the right ventricle. The right ventricle only pumps blood to the lungs, which isn't that far away. The left ventricle pumps blood, up to your head, down to your pinky toe. So it has to be a much stronger muscular chamber. This is the same diagram we saw a minute ago. So here's right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle, left atrium. So there's two main circulatory routes that the heart services. So the systemic is the route that sends blood through all your body systems. It's systemic. It pumps blood from the left side of your heart, right? Your left circulatory system, so your left ventricle, to the tissues of your body. It's what's pumping oxygenated blood throughout your body, all right? The pulmonary circuit, or the pulmonary circulation, is the circuit that pumps blood from the right side of your heart to your lungs to get oxygenated blood. And we've said this before, but in this diagram, you can see, so we use the colors blue and red. Blue, blood is never blue. We've said this a million times. So there's one thing you remember from me. Remember, the blood is never blue, right? The left side is the systemic circuit, which is pumping blood throughout your body to nourish your tissues. The right side, and we color that blood red because red blood in textbooks means it has oxygen. The right side, we color it blue. This is the notation that we use in diagrams, is to cover blood that's deoxygenated as blue, but it's the right side of your heart that pumps blood to your lungs. Then it goes back to the left side to pump to your body. This picture, this is a wonderful picture, but it's a little bit misleading. This shows, like here's your heart, right? It shows your lungs as being above your heart. Well, your lungs are really more around your heart, right? So it's not really pumping blood up necessarily. And then it shows your capillary beds that nourish your tissues as being below the heart, which they can be. The capillary beds of your digestive system or your pinky toe are definitely, below your heart. But you could be pumping blood that has oxygen up to your head. So this diagram is a little bit simplistic. It's not that your lungs are above your head or your capillaries are below your head. It's not always pumping up and down. It pumps blood in all directions. This diagram is just sort of simplifying the two circuits. Here's the systemic circuit down here, where blood goes from being oxygenated to deoxygenated because it loses blood to your tissues. Here's your pulmonary circuit, where blood goes from being deoxygenated to being oxygenated because it's receiving blood through the lungs. And this is just the same diagram bigger. If it's helpful, you might want to pause this video just to look at this for a second. This is in your textbook too, just to make sure you understand what's going on here. So your heart valves. So you have 4 valves, which we've discussed the valves already, to prevent backflow, blood going in the wrong direction or back where it came from. So you have 2 what are called AV, or atrioventricular valves. They're between an atria and a ventricle, so the right one or the left one. The left one you call the bicuspid or mitral valve, and the right one you call the tricuspid valve. We'll see pictures of these in a minute. Then you have the 2 semilunar valves, which are between a ventricle and an artery. So the right ventricle pumps blood up to the lungs, right? So the pulmonary semilunar valve is on the right-hand side of your heart, coming off your right ventricle up to the pulmonary artery, right? The aortic semilunar valve would be coming off the left ventricle up into the aorta to carry blood throughout the rest of your body. So there's 4. There's 2 semilunar, which are between a ventricle and an artery, either the pulmonary artery or the aorta, and the 2 AV valves between either the right or the left atria and ventricle. So we saw this when we did the heart schematic in the previous video, but you can see here's the tricuspid valve. You see how these kind of look like a tooth, hence the term cuspid. Tricuspid valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The bicuspid valve here is between the right the left ventricle and the left atria. There's those two. And here you can see the two semilunar valves that look kind of like half moons. So here's the pulmonary semilunar valve between the left ventricle going into the pulmonary artery, and then the aortic semilunar valve between the left ventricle going up into the aorta. Okay, and while we're looking at this picture, so there's 4 of these, and the way that valves work is they open and close in pairs. Okay, so picture the, let's say you're a blood cell and you're inside the right ventricle. If this ventricle is pumping blood, you want blood to go up. You want it to go that way, right up into the pulmonary artery. You don't want it to go back where it came from. So picture the 2 ventricles pumping at the same time. Picture the right ventricle, the left ventricle pumping in concert, which is what they do. When they both pump, the semilunar valves are open, and the AV valves, mitral and tricuspid valves, are closed, right? When the heart's not pumping, when the heart's relaxed, you want blood to go from the atria into the ventricles. So when the heart is filling, right? When the heart is filling, you want these two valves to be open. You want your AV valves to be open because the heart's the ventricles are filling with blood. And you want these 2 valves to be closed because you don't want the blood that you just pumped up here or pumped up there to come back in. So the semilunar valves open and close at the same time, and the AV valves open and close at the same time. So there's 4 valves, but they open and close in pairs. And again, the idea is to make sure blood doesn't come back from where it just was. You want blood going in like a one-way direction. So we kind of just said all this. Oh, one thing I should have said, the chordae tendineae, these are called heartstrings. They're what anchor the heart valves to the walls of the ventricles. If like picture this valve closing. If you didn't have the anchor points here, the valve could be flipped inside out. The word for that's prolapse. We'll talk about prolapse later. If these don't have a good anchoring point, then picture this ventricle contracting, what would prevent the valve from like flipping inside outward up into the atrium, right? Well, you want the valve to be anchored to the heart muscle wall. Those are called chordae tendineae. You can feel them with your finger if you put your finger into the valves. They're kind of, the nicknamed heartstrings. Anyway, so again, so the AV valves anchored by chordae tendineae, we just said that. The AV valves are open when the heart is relaxed or filling, and they are closed when the ventricles are contracting. The semilunar valves are the opposite. They're closed when the heart is relaxed, so the blood doesn't come back where it came from, but they're open when the ventricles are contracted to pump blood up into either the pulmonary artery or the aorta. And notice these valves operate opposite of one another. We just said that to make sure blood goes in a one-way direction. So this is a diagram from your book. We're not going to read through all this, but I want to show the pictures. So like, do you see, this is an AV valve. If blood's, these are called one-way valves. If blood's flowing down, in this case from an atrium into a ventricle, the blood flow naturally pushes the valve open. If blood tried to go back in the opposite direction when the ventricle was pumping, see how they kind of swell shut? So it's, it's simply just the way the valves are designed, the way they function. Blood can only go in one direction. If blood tries to go back where it came from, it like swells upward, and because they're anchored here, blood can't go back where it came from. The idea of prolapse, if you have a heart murmur, is that the valve isn't anchored quite as good as it should be. Blood can kind of squirt back where it came from. In a heart murmur, your heartbeat has the lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. A heart murmur sounds kind of like a squirt, like a lub-dub with a little squirt in between. You can hear it with a stethoscope. That would be if the valve is slightly going inside out, blood's going back where it came from. That might be a huge problem, or it might not be that much of a problem at all. It just depends on what kind of heart murmur you have. So this is the same schematic, but with semilunar valves, the two like half moon shaped cups. If blood's going up, it pushes the valve open. If blood tries to come down back where it came from, you can see how the valve sort of swells shut, right? So you can see in this case, the blood can't come down. In the previous case, the blood can't go up, all right? All right. If you can picture that in your head, it kind of helps you understand how these valves work. So cardiac circulation, so your heart is a very giving organ. Lots of blood flows through your heart, right? But the heart itself isn't nourished by the blood going through the heart. The heart's nourished by its own circulatory system. Let me show you a quick picture. So you see in the heart, you have these vessels on the outside of the heart. Like here you see the left coronary artery in this groove of the heart. The heart's nourished from the outside. So basically you have coronary arteries, which are little arteries that branch from the aorta and then go on the outside of the heart to nourish the heart with blood that has oxygen. You have cardiac veins, which are veins that drain the heart's myocardium of blood. Well, once the blood that's nourishing the heart loses oxygen, you want it, you want it to drain. In this case, I think it empties in the right atrium. Yeah, down here in the right atrium. The coronary sinus is a large vein on the posterior side of the heart that receives blood from the cardiac veins, and then it empties into the right atrium. All right. If you had a blockage in the coronary arteries or veins, that can cause a heart attack, right? And that's bad because if you're not nourishing the heart itself, the heart muscle will start to die. All right. Because again, the blood or the heart doesn't take oxygen from blood going through it. The heart takes oxygen from its own circulatory system, what's described on this slide. Having a coronary is a nickname for having a heart attack. It's if your coronary artery, say, is blocked, the heart muscle will start to die. And here you can see, in this diagram, you can see the anterior cardiac vein, the left coronary artery. You can see these arteries and veins that are nourishing the heart or that are draining blood from the heart. Okay, so brief word about arteries and veins. So the blood that branches off the heart going to your body is called the aorta. It leaves the left ventricle. Then the arteries that branch off the right ventricle to go to your lungs are called pulmonary arteries. Remember, you define an artery by direction. If it takes blood away from the heart, it's an artery. It's not just if it has oxygen or not. Remember, the pulmonary artery and vein is opposite what you normally think. The pulmonary artery is going away from the heart, right? But it has deox blood. The pulmonary veins are going toward the heart, but they have blood that is oxygenated. Anyway, so the main arteries coming off your heart are the aorta going to your body, and the pulmonary arteries going to your lungs. The main veins associated with your heart would be the superior and inferior vena cava. They're the ones that collect and enter into the right atrium. Then your pulmonary veins, there are 4 of them that bring blood from your heart into your left atrium. Let's show a quick picture. So here you have, well, where should we start? Here we have the superior and inferior vena cava. Again, these are pictured blue because it's deox blood. Here we have the pulmonary artery, which branches into a left and right hand side because you have 2 sides of your lungs. It's blue. It's an artery, but it's blue because it carries blood away from the heart. Here you have the left and right pulmonary veins. There's 2 right there. There's 2 right there. They're the ones that are carrying blood from your lungs to your left atrium. Then you have the aorta, the big boy right here that carries blood from your left ventricle. These branches from the aorta go up to your head and your neck. Then obviously the branches to take blood throughout your entire body. Okay, so these next 2 slides, really when we did the schematic of the heart, we've been through all this blood flow through the heart. If you can name, if you can pretend like you're a red blood cell and you can name all the structures that you go through or go past, then you got this, right? Basically, blood enters the right atrium through the inferior and superior vena cava. Blood then goes into the right atrium, right? Then it goes past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it gets pumped up to the pulmonary artery, past this pulmonary semilunar valve, the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary artery, or it splits into left and right halves, and the blood goes to your lungs where it gets oxygenated. All right. Oxygen's picked up, CO2 is dropped off in the lungs, in which case the oxygen-rich blood returns to the heart via the 4 pulmonary veins. Blood enters the left atrium, then goes past the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, where it then gets pumped up into the aorta. It goes past the aortic semilunar valve up to the aorta, and then through your body, and the cycle repeats. All right. Okay. So, we've seen this diagram several times already. This is half of chapter 11. If you understand what's going on here, what the chambers do, what the valves are, what blood's doing, when it's where, why, and how, if you can explain this diagram, then you've got half the chapter very, very well settled in your head. Or in your heart, maybe. No, bad joke. We'll just keep going on. Okay, so things that we did not do in that first video with the schematics. So your heart has a thing called a pacemaker. You've heard of this before. So your heart has its own intrinsic conduction system called the nodal system, which basically means that your heart, the nervous stimulation of your heart, getting your heart to beat, your brain and your spinal column don't really control it. Your heart can beat all by itself. Now the heart does, like if you're brain dead and your brain's not working anymore, your heart will continue to beat for a short period of time. Eventually your heart will die, because if your brain's not functioning, then your lungs aren't working, right? But if I keep you on a ventilator and I'm like working your lungs with a machine, the heart will keep beating for a period of time, even though you're brain dead, because the heart muscle itself, as long as you keep it nourished, it's going to keep beating. The idea of a pacemaker, the heart has its own rhythmic nervous system to keep it pumping in a regular way without any kind of interference that needed by your brain. Now your brain can, we discussed the whole fight or flight response. Your brain can make your heart rate go up or go down. If you have a burst of adrenaline, your heart rate beats up. So your brain can control your heart to an extent, but your heart has its own nervous system to keep it pumping and beating regularly. And again, you want it beating. When I say regularly, I mean the ventricles contract together, then the atria contract together. So there's a rhythmic, there are rhythmic pulses to your heartbeat. That's controlled by your pacemaker, not your brain. So very, very briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but see this thing called the SA node, the sinoatrial node right here. It's just in the right atrium, and you see the arrows going down. So this is a little patch of nervous tissue. Then you have this thing called the AV node. You have atrioventricular bundles, the AV bundle, or also called the bundle of His. You have what are called bundle branches. You have what are called Purkinje fibers. Basically, long story short, like picture the heart contraction starting here in the atria, then it moves down the heart to the ventricles. So you want this thing to be contracting in a rhythm going top to bottom, which is controlled by the SA node. The different parts of the heart's pacemaker. So the SA node is called the pacemaker in the right atrium. Then you have the atrioventricular node, which is between atria and ventricles. That's not shocking. You have what's called the atrioventricular bundle, or the bundle of His, which is also, or is in the interventricular septum. It's in the interventricular septum. That's a lot of syllables in one sentence. Then you have bundle branches that are in the interventricular septum. Then you have what are called Purkinje fibers that spread throughout the walls of the ventricle. All right. There's a lot on this slide. I want you to know for sure that this is controlled by the SA node, which is in your right atrium. Like I want you to know SA node, and I want you to understand that the rhythmic contractions go from top to bottom. So a picture like this, we've already seen this. Like I'm not going to give you this to label. I'm not going to ask you about any of these parts except for the SA node. But if you saw this picture on a test, you should understand that this is controlling it, and then it goes to AV nodes, to atrioventricular nodes, to these bundle branches, to these Purkinje fibers. Like you should understand from top to bottom how the contraction kind of like waves down the heart. Okay, and people who have like have issues with this where it's not rhythmic. You can have what's called an arrhythmia, where your heart doesn't beat in a rhythmic fashion, which can cause lots of problems. And people have a pacemaker put in artificially in their heart, a little device they implant in your chest to keep your heart pumping regularly. That's called a pacemaker. You have a natural pacemaker, which begins, or it's located, the pulses begin in the SA node, which is in your right atrium. Okay. We've already said this. It begins in the SA node. You get these autorhythmic contractions throughout your heart, and this forces the heart muscle to depolarize in one direction. So it goes from atria down to ventricles. Okay. Anything new on this slide? Nope. Starts in the SA node, goes down, the atria contract, and the ventricles contract. So it goes AV bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. And the idea is to eject blood from the atria to the ventricles, then up to either the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. Okay, basically, I want you to know SA node, right ventricle, rhythmic contractions, top to bottom. Same picture. Okay, so let's move on to a cardiac cycle and heart sounds. So systole and diastole, so this is going to relate to your blood pressure later, but we've already said this. You want your atria to do their thing together and your ventricles to do their thing together, all right? A systole is when the ventricles are contracting. A diastole is when the ventricles are relaxed. So systole is a contraction. A diastole is a relaxation, okay? When we do blood pressure, the two numbers, like 120/80, that's your systolic and diastolic blood pressure. We'll get to that more in a minute. Systole, contraction, diastole, relaxation, okay? So what essentially happens here, let me move my face. So let's begin a cardiac cycle. Where are we beginning? We're beginning mid to late diastole. So we're at the end of the ventricles being relaxed, okay? This should be when your blood pressure was in the bottom number, the diastolic pressure. So the pressure in the heart is low, all right? Your heart's chilling. When your heart's chilling, blood's flowing from the atria into the ventricles, right? When you do that, the AV valves are open, the semilunar valves are closed, all right? And the atria do contract to force blood into the ventricles. So when we say the heart's relaxed, it's a little misleading. The ventricles are relaxed. The atria actually can also pump to a much smaller degree. So they're forcing blood down the heart from atria into ventricles, all right? So now we're going to get to the a ventricular systole when the ventricles are contracting, right? So this would be right before blood pressure is building up, then the ventricles contract. They force blood up into either the pulmonary artery or the aorta. That would be the lub part of your heart, but you know, lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. The lub part is the sound of the AV valves slamming closed because blood's being forced up through an artery, pulmonary or aorta. So the AV valves are closed so the blood doesn't accidentally go back into the atria where they just came from. The semilunar valves are open, so you're not blocking blood flow that way. And again, the atria are relaxed as you pump blood up to the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery, or the aorta, okay? By the end of the systole, there's a time when all four valves are briefly closed. The second heart sound is the sound as the semilunar valves are closing, causing the dub sound. So the lub is when the AV valves are closed. The dub is when the semilunar valves are closed. At this point, the atria finish refilling. Of course, when the atria refill, the next thing to do is to have that blood go into your ventricles. So at this point, you want the ventricular pressure to be low so they can receive the blood from the atria. And obviously the AV valves open again. So that just repeats the cycle. In your textbook, they have these diagram or this diagram here. You know, this shows the blood going from the atria to the ventricles. The heart's more or less relaxed. The atria contract. See how the atria go from that shape to that shape? They're contracting, but not like a ventricle contracts. They fill the ventricles. Then you get a systole where the ventricles themselves contract to push blood up to either the aorta or up to the pulmonary artery here or the aorta here. And then there's a short time when all four valves are closed so the atria can fill. And of course, then you would repeat the cycle here. All right. Okay. So quick little word on arteries and veins. So arteries, by definition, carry blood away from the heart. Arteries branch into what are called arterioles. You want arteries to be decently thick because if they burst, that's going to be a problem because the blood's flowing pretty quickly because it just came off the heart. So an artery branches into an arteriole. Arterioles branch into capillary beds. Capillary beds are very, very thin. You have capillary beds throughout your entire body. They're generally about one cell layer thick. And that's where you exchange nutrients. So either you offload CO2, you offload oxygen, you upload CO2, you upload toxins, you offload nutrients from your digestive system. You want them to be thin because that's where you're exchanging stuff, right? A capillary bed then becomes a venule, which then becomes a vein. So in order, if you're a red blood cell coming off the aorta, right? You're in an artery, then an arteriole, then a capillary bed where you exchange, then you fuse into venules and then veins, then you're back to the vena cava. And you can see in this picture, arteries are much thicker than veins, blood's flowing much faster and under higher pressure in an artery than a vein, because again, the closer you are to the heart or where the system began, the cycle began, the faster blood's going to be going. If you cut your finger, that's cutting a vein, you're going to bleed, but you're not going to squirt blood across the room. If I cut an artery, like my aorta or a carotid artery in your neck, you're going to squirt blood across the room, which means you're going to have probably a very, very bad day. Arteries are thicker than veins, like we just said. Capillary beds or capillaries are very, very thin to allow for exchange. Veins also have these things called valves, kind of like in the heart, that prevent backflow. So in an artery, like between heartbeats, blood never really goes backwards in an artery because the blood pressure was so high during the heartbeat, blood doesn't have a chance to go backwards. Think of it like going upstream and downstream. If you're in a in a river with a very, very fast current, trying to go upstream is like impossible. If you're in a low, lazy river, swimming upstream is more doable because the current's lower. So in a vein, if you see this picture right here, see these valves right here, here's a valve. In this picture, you want blood to be flowing upward. Veins can go against gravity, right? So if blood tried to go back down, it would close this valve, kind of like the case with semilunar valves. Arteries don't have these, but veins do have them. So under low pressure, the blood won't go backwards. Veins also have a larger lumen. They just have a larger space than arteries generally do. Oftentimes, veins also are embedded within skeletal muscle. So as the skeletal muscle is moving, the verb here is to milk. As the muscles are moving, it helps keep blood flowing in the right direction. Like you can see in this picture, it would be hard for blood to come back down because of that valve and just the muscle contraction kind of encouraging the blood to go in one direction. So a quick word on fetal circulation. So for a baby in the womb. So that like a growing fetus, the heart starts beating as early as 5 or 6 weeks, right? So the heart's beating, pumping blood throughout the fetus, throughout the baby's circulatory system, but the baby doesn't take its first breath till it's born, right? The baby is in the amniotic sac with amniotic fluid surrounding it. So if a baby breathes in the womb, it's going to be breathing amniotic fluid, which that's not a good idea to get fluid into the lungs. So the baby's circulation is based upon its blood flowing, but it doesn't get nutrients from itself. It gets nutrients through the placenta. So basically the baby's blood and the mom's blood, they don't actually mix. We said this before when we did the chapter on blood. They don't mix in the placenta, but the capillary beds are thin enough where gases can exchange between the mom's and the baby's blood. And then the baby has the umbilical cord, which goes from the baby to the placenta, to the mom. Or actually, the baby, then umbilical cord, then placenta, then the mom. I think I said that a little bit ago. There's 3 vessels in the umbilical cord. There are 2 umbilical veins. There's 1 umbilical vein, and there are 2 umbilical arteries. So we define these by direction. 2 are from the fetus's heart. So the umbilical vein is carrying blood to the baby's heart. So it's a vein because it's going toward, but in this case, it has oxygen nutrients because it just came from the mom, from the placenta. The umbilical arteries, it's an artery because it carries blood away from the baby's heart. But once it's going away from the heart, it's largely lost all of its oxygen and nutrients due to the nutrients or oxygen being taken into the fetus's tissues, right? Quick diagram. I don't want to go into too much detail on this just because this chapter's got enough detail as it is. But here's the placenta. Here's the umbilical cord. Here you see the two umbilical arteries. You see the umbilical vein. So briefly going in order, so the blood intermixes in the, or nutrients go back and forth in the placenta. Then you have the umbilical vein, which is highly oxygenated because it just came from mom. And you see how here it's like, it hooks up to the inferior vena cava, which, you know, has deox blood. It's in the baby. And the blood kind of mixes. This shows purple because the oxygenated deoxygenated mix is changing with the mix. Then it goes into the heart. Then the baby's heart beats to pump the nutrients throughout the baby's circulatory system, right? A couple things different from a normal person. So first off, you don't really want blood going into the lungs, right? So there are things to prevent blood from going to the baby's lungs. And see this little arrow right here between the pulmonary artery and the aorta, there's a little arrow right there. The structure is called the ductus arteriosus. There's actually a little like hole right there. We'll get to this on a slide in a minute, where blood, you know, in a normal person, here blood would be going into the lungs. Well, there's a little like bypass valve or bypass shunt, I guess is a better word, where blood can go straight from the pulmonary artery into the aorta, so it doesn't go to the lungs. And actually, there's another little gap between the right and left atria. You can't really see it. Actually, you can. It's labeled the foramen ovale here, where blood goes between the right atrium and the right ventricle, where basically it more or less bypasses the ventricles. Blood that does get to the ventricles gets bypassed into the aorta via the ductus arteriosus right here. All right. Okay. So this is what we just said. Move myself. Oh, one thing I should have said. So in a minute, we're going to see that your liver is super duper duper important. This thing called the ductus venosus, for a person that's born, right, or going into a toddler or an adult, blood going through your liver is incredibly important, right, from the day you're born. But you don't want it to happen yet until you're actually breathing on your own. So this ductus venosus right here is, it's again like a bypass shunt that takes the blood directly into the vena cava and doesn't go through the liver. That's this first point. The blood bypasses the liver, it goes to the vena cava, then to the right atrium. Of course, by the time you're born, you want that to have sealed off. Blood flow bypasses the lungs in two ways. There's the foramen ovale, which was a little hole between the left and right atrium. Once you're born, there's a structure in your heart, this fossa ovalis, this like groove right here. That's what's left of the foramen ovale by the time you're born. If it's not fully sealed by the time that you are born, there's a hole there. You know, you're born with the hole in your heart, right? Which, if that's the case, oftentimes the baby, when it's born, the tissues might appear blue, and baby isn't getting enough oxygenated blood. You have to have a little surgery to fix it, but normally it heals on its own. The ductus arteriosus was the shunt that connected the aorta and the pulmonary artery, and it becomes the ligamentum right here, the ligamentum arteriosum right here. In a fetus, this is a little like tunnel, a little shunt, where blood goes from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta and bypasses the lungs entirely. Okay, so the remnants of those are the fossa ovalis, this thing right here, and the ligamentum arteriosum, this ligament right here. Okay, so hepatic portal circulation. So anything hepatic refers to your liver. We haven't done your liver yet, at least in terms of the book. Anything hepatic, anything hepato, hepatitis, hepatic, anything hepatic refers to your liver. So, okay. For reasons we'll see in a minute, you know, your liver does a ton of different things for you. It's not just part of your digestive system. Remember how we said that your liver has a short-term glucose supply, it stores it as glycogen. Your liver can sort of, your liver is good at helping to determine and sort of like scan or to assess what's going on with your blood during your circulation, right? If your blood sugar falls too low, your liver will break down the glycogen to raise your blood sugar, right? So having what's called the hepatic portal circulation, your digestive organs, your spleen, your pancreas, as blood leaves those regions, as the blood drains into a vein, it goes into what's called the hepatic portal vein, which then carries the blood to the liver. And your blood helps, or your liver helps to regulate and helps to monitor what's in your blood after it goes through your digestive organs, all right? Your liver helps to maintain proper glucose, fat, protein concentrations. You've already discussed that. So let's look at this diagram first. So this diagram, so this is showing veins, and in this case, blood's flowing up this diagram. It's flowing up from your digestive organs, your intestine, your stomach. This is your liver. The hepatic portal vein is this one right here. So after the blood drains or leaves your digestive organs, it then goes into your liver, right? And going back a slide, so the general scheme here would be blood flows through an artery, then it flows through a capillary bed, like we've been saying before in this chapter, to nourish your tissues. At this point, your blood doesn't really have a lot of nutrients left to it. It's lacking. It needs to go back to your heart, right? Then the blood goes through the hepatic portal vein, which is, again, this one right here. And then the blood goes through your liver. And your liver, through the second capillary bed, the cells of your liver also helps detoxify things. So it detoxifies alcohol, it detoxifies drugs, it detoxifies things that shouldn't be there. This is when your liver really gets to work. And your blood goes through your liver after it's done most of what it's going to do, because your liver helps to monitor your blood. Your hepatic portal circulation, that's what's going on here. And then the blood ends up linking up to in this case, the inferior vena cava, and then goes to your right atrium, okay? So again, going back just a quick second, the hepatic portal circulation, it's important because your liver helps to regulate a lot of things in your body. It monitors your blood, and basically all of your bloods, think of it as being like one last hall monitor. Your liver's monitoring your blood one more time before it goes back to the heart via the hepatic portal vein. So blood goes through your digestive organs, hepatic portal vein, then your liver, then up to the vena cava. The book goes into way more detail on this. For our purposes, I just kind of want to hit the highlights as to what hepatic portal circulation is. So pulse, we can do this super fast. Your average pulse, 70 and 80 beats per minute. You can measure your pulse at many places. Your neck, your wrist, the brachial artery, you can measure it in your foot, in your groin, the back of your knee. It's just measuring how many beats per minute. You can feel the blood pulsing. Not a whole lot to say about that. Blood pressure. I think we're going to end with blood pressure. So your blood pressure is a very useful thing to monitor, to it's a good indication of your overall health as to what your blood pressure is. So, the two numbers, average blood pressure is like 120/80. The unit is millimeters of mercury, which is a unit of pressure. We're not going to worry about where that comes from. So the top numbers, the systolic pressure, which is when your ventricles are pumping, the height of your blood pressure. The bottom number is the diastolic number, which is the pressure when your ventricles are relaxed. Notice the pressure doesn't go to zero. If the pressure were going to zero, your blood would not be flowing at all, which means you're dead, right? So you don't want the pressure to go too low. It's basically the pressure of your blood against the walls of your blood vessels, right? Systolic is the highest, diastolic is the lowest. Well, I'm very sure we're very likely to do a lab on blood pressure during this unit. The pressure does decrease as distance from the heart increases. So here you can see systolic pressure, diastolic pressure. Here's the 120/80. Good average of this looks more like 90. Average in your aorta, and as you go arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, back in the vena cava, the blood pressure decreases because you're further from, not so much from the heart, but further from where the beat was initiated, where you first came off the left ventricle into the aorta. Okay. The way you generally do blood pressure, you generally use the brachial artery. This says 120/70 for a healthy young person. So generally what you do, and we'll do this in class, you take a cuff, you inflate the cuff to where you momentarily stop blood flow through your arm. And you have a stethoscope right here monitoring, you're listening to the blood sounds through your aorta. So right now, if there's no blood flowing, you can't hear any sounds at all. So there's nothing to do. Then you slowly start to release the pressure. So this shows you pumping it up past 120. Maybe you pump it to 180, whatever. Then you slowly release the pressure. And the first time you hear a sound, that's when blood first re-enters the artery. And that would be the systolic pressure. That would be when the pressure is the highest, when it can first get through. Then you keep listening and you can hear the blood flowing. When you stop hearing blood flowing, that pressure is the diastolic pressure. Because when you stop hearing it flow, that means it's flowing freely through the brachial artery. And that would be the lowest blood pressure. When it's flowing freely, that's the lowest pressure, right? Because you haven't constricted it at all. Again, we'll do a lab on this in class at some point. I already said this, right? That's when blood's flowing freely when you have the bottom number. Factors that affect your blood pressure. If your blood pressure is off, there's got to be a reason why. It could just be, maybe something spooked you and your blood pressure went up momentarily because it triggered the fight or flight mechanisms in your body. But if it's elevated or too low for long periods of time, that's an indication something's going on with your health. And having blood pressure too high, especially hypertension, can damage your blood vessels. It can actually do damage to the tissues in your body. So you want to, figure out what's going on. So age, weight, time of day, exercise, body position, like if you're laying down versus sitting versus standing up, your emotional state, neural factors, your autonomic nervous system, the whole fight or flight hormonal system can definitely raise your blood pressure. Renal factors. Remember how we said back when we did chapter 9, there are hormones that can raise or lower your blood volume. If I increase your blood volume, your blood pressure goes up. If I decrease your blood volume, your blood pressure goes down. Remember renin, aldosterone, those different hormones that can affect your, the ultimate effect how much you urinate. If you're urinating a lot, then you're decreasing blood volume, which that would lower your blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too low, you might want to decrease how much you urinate, which would result in increasing or decreasing less your blood volume. So anyway, all those renal factors in your kidneys, your adrenal glands affect your blood pressure by affecting your blood volume. Temperature, blood vessels that are hotter causes them to vasodilate, which would decrease your blood pressure. Being cold vasoconstricts them, like putting your finger into a fire hose, the water goes faster. That would increase your blood pressure. And diet, obviously diet, if you have a very fatty diet, you can get fatty plaques on the inside of your blood vessels, which makes them smaller, which would increase your blood pressure. This is a diagram from your textbook where you can look at this yourself that just sort of summarizes all the different ways that your body can regulate your blood pressure. All right, last slide in this chapter. This has been a long one. So normal blood pressure, we said 120 over 80 is average. This says 140 to 110 for the top number. For your systolic, 80 to 75 for diastolic. Hypotension would be low blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too low, that's a problem because you're not transporting blood efficiently. It could be, obviously, if you have like some kind of internal wound and you're bleeding internally, that could cause low blood pressure, or it could be a sign of some kind of illness. What we most worry about is hypertension, which is high blood pressure, which lots of things could lead to that. Poor diet, smoking can cause your arteries to harden, which means the blood pressure goes up because they're not as elastic as they normally are. Stress can also cause high blood pressure. If you have chronic high blood pressure, that's a problem because one, it means your heart's working too hard. And two, it causes, your vessels to become weak or not as elastic as they should be. And it can be a sign that you're actually having damage to your heart or blood vessels because your blood pressure is too high. Okay, we're going to end it there. That was a long one, but I hope that was helpful, and I will see you guys next time.